Before I start the presentation, and also without wanting to put our interpreters on the spot, I'd just like to switch for a few seconds to Romanian. Bună dimineața tuturor și doresc să le mulțumesc organizatorilor pentru invitație. Îmi pare foarte rău că nu pot fi în Cluj astăzi pentru a revedea colegi, pentru a revedea colaboratori, dar în special pentru a învăța lucruri noi de la organizatorii atelierelor care urmează, dar, cum se spune, nu poți să le ai pe toate în viață, cred. Deci trebuie să mă mulțumesc să discutăm prin Zoom, pentru că această prezentare este înregistrată și pentru că pot profita de aceasta pentru a transmite câteva dintre mesajele care tot circulă despre traducerea automată. Acum voi trece la engleză. Okay, so my name is Dragoș, and for a while I have been playing with translation technologies, CAT tools, also machine translation. And my background is in languages. I'm a trained translator and interpreter. And I've also worked in-house as a technical writer and translator before joining the academia. So in my work, I tend to have as many practical applications and real-world case studies. And that's what I've tried to do today, to include a lot of examples. Some of them might be familiar to colleagues who know me and have seen me present before, but they are still important to be mentioned. So I hope everyone will have something new and something interesting today. As you've heard, I'm now working in Vienna, and I'm in charge of the High Trans Research Group, Human and Artificial Intelligence in Translation, where together with Alina and Miguel, as well as with Raluca, Claudia, and Justus, our PhD students, we are trying to find new ways of making it more effective or also more ergonomic for professional translators, but also volunteer translators, to use technologies in a creative way and in an effective way, as I've said, to deliver better results. Today, what's on the menu? A few things. I kind of got a bit excited, so I've added lots of things. I hope everything makes sense, and I also hope I finish. So we'll start with seeing a few examples of using the output of machine translation models. So we'll discuss post-editing. We'll also see some examples where raw machine translation output is used. And also, as we've heard in the introductions, technology is progressing, and now large language models, generally known as AI, although machine translation is also a form of AI. But anyway, large language models are being increasingly used and also are asked to do machine translation tasks. So we'll see how that goes sometimes. We'll also look behind the scenes at how machine translation models are built. And so without being a historian, I think it's useful to have a look at some examples from the earlier paradigms and question some of the assumptions, and also revisit some of the training and evaluation data sets and models, because they still apply to the new technology. And we'll also look for ways to support translators. Perhaps there are new ways to work with machine translation output. I'm not saying anything. I kind of have to wait and see. And also, given that machine translation is usually introduced under the productivity banner, it's often promoted as being a very capable technology, which allows us to save time and also cost. I'll also present an alternative view, given that you will see in this presentation, but also you've heard the description of the workshops. You will also see during the workshops examples of when machine translation is actually not as wonderful as it's presented. I'll So I'll present an alternative to achieve this much coveted productivity increase as well. So a lot of things to discuss. For those of you, perhaps the students in the audience who want to keep an eye on what's new and what's exciting in the field of machine translation, I recommend the Slater website as one of the news aggregators. And we've seen for a few years and more lately, a lot of big claims about machine translation reaching the same level of quality as humans. We've heard about increasingly multilingual machine translation models being developed, and all the big companies have these announcements, and some of them also focus on low resource languages. And this is an important message, key takeaway straight away. Some of the messages that we see in the media, they tend to generalize the actual reality, because in the field of machine translation, there is no parity between languages. So what happens for one language pair and one domain is not guaranteed to happen for the others as well, especially if there is no training data around. So there are lots of, excuse me, big claims, which sometimes need to be taken with a pinch of salt. And there's also the other side of the coin, the research into aspects which actually affect artificial intelligence in general. We've heard about bias also regarding image generation, a few case studies in the news lately. I'm sure they caught your attention. We are facing the same problem in machine translation, and I'll have some examples. Also, there is concern that machine translation limits creativity, not just in literary translation, but actually in general. And there is, as we need more training data to continuously improve the quality of these models, there is also the problem that this training data is machine translation generated, and so it's kind of becoming a circle. Is it vicious? Is it a positive one? We only need to look at the results and then say. But what is certain is that machine translation is still a hot topic of research. There are lots of providers of machine translation services out there. And again, I'd like to put on your radar this company called Intento, which produces annual reports into the state of machine translation. So from this screenshot, you can see that some names you might recognize, some not. But what is important is to see that there is a mix of generic models, so models that were trained with generally available data, so no specific domain. But also there are vertical stock models, which are fine-tuned for specific domains or even trained from scratch for specific domains, for instance, for medical translation or for legal translation or financial translation. E-translation itself, the machine translation service of the European Commission, has fine-tuned models for specific domains, but it's not a commercial product, so therefore it doesn't feature in this report. And also, given that terminology and the accuracy of our translations is key, the story has changed somewhat from rule-based machine translation and statistical machine translations, which were the initial paradigms, which allowed the control of terminology much better. So this situation has changed, and it's harder to control terminology in neural machine translation. But still, there are some providers that offer custom terminology support, and also they offer domain adaptation for specific domains. And finally, as I've mentioned, large language models, generative AI, to use the more general term, are also now performing fairly well in machine translation tasks. So it's a very diverse field, and it's certainly interesting to keep an eye on it. Machine translation is integrated into audiovisual environments. Well, we all have a mobile, so we all have Google Translate or Microsoft Translator or other DeepL, other providers on the phone. But it's not just the mobile devices. This screenshot shows you a picture of Limecraft Flow, which is a web-based audiovisual translation environment that does quite a few things automatically that used to be done manually and used to take longer. Starting with the automatic recognition of the speech in the video and its transcription, followed by an automatic translation into, in this case, Romanian, because we're talking at Translating Europe workshop Cluj. And this saves some time for some tasks, but also sometimes is not as accurate as we would perhaps hope it is. And still we need to have attention to detail and to really have excellent translation skills and subject matter expertise as well in order to pick up errors and correct them. Part of this attempt to integrate machine translation into more and more applications and make information more and more accessible. Another project to put on your radars is the Eliter project, which uses automatic speech recognition of either news programs or even European institution official events. And then it follows that up with machine translation into several EU languages. And again, it's a useful initiative for sure, and the quality of the technology is constantly improving. But at the same time, I don't know how big your screens are, but there are some issues, and it's still very much work in progress. So I'm saying this just to manage expectations, because sometimes the hype around machine translation and certainly around artificial intelligence gets a little bit out of control. So coming back to the title, what's this about? What's with the childish title? It's a little bit like there is a rabbit hole. So as soon as you start looking into the topic of machine translation and also its implementations, it genuinely is like a giant rabbit hole opens up and you just fall through and you're wondering where you're gonna end. So in Alice in Wonderland, Alice cries curiouser and curiouser at one point because she was so much surprised that for the moment she quite forgot how to speak good English. And this is also, when I was reading this, I thought it's very similar to machine translation applications as well, because there is one aspect which is called the priming effect, which essentially means when you are presented with a stimulus, and in this case it is the machine translation hypothesis, this influences your processing and it influences how you are going to formulate your translation afterwards. We like to think we are not easy to influence, but actually the reality says we are. And this interference, called by some researchers post-edits, is present in machine translated and post-edited texts. So it's something really to look out for. And now I'm talking directly to the students in the audience, because there is a temptation to trust machine translation simply because it is nowadays very fluent. But actually you really have to continue working on your mother tongue, on your language skills, on your writing skills, and make sure you don't simply copy the structure of the source language into the target language. There is research into that, and this syntactic level priming is obvious and has been measured, so it's something to keep in mind for sure. And I'm sure the workshops this afternoon will come back to this idea and give you even more examples. On the other side, so it's not all bad. And by the way, this presentation is not supposed to be an attack on machine translation. It's just supposed to present some examples and raise or wave a couple of flags just to maybe temper some of the expectations that are sort of flying around. So on the positive side, there are researchers who are looking into the use of machine translation, especially neural machine translation. That's what NMT stands for. And the use of this technology by literary translators. And because, as we'll see, neural machine translation doesn't really work with words as such, it works mainly with word portions because it has to. We'll look at why. These subwords, sometimes called byte pair encodings, sometimes called sentence piece elements, they result in creative recombinations. So things that weren't there in the original, which sometimes are called hallucinations. And I guess like all hallucinations, sometimes they're desirable and sometimes they are not. So even humans sometimes hallucinate and create a masterpiece of creative writing or painting or music or whatever. But other times we would really like to understand what they mean and they don't make sense. So there is this element in machine translation research. Just to sort of break up the tension, the first example comes from Google, Bing, and DeepL, and it's an example of how machine translation is, in some cases, quite capable of dealing with unusual, non-standard source text, because at the end of the day, curiouser is not correct English. It should be more curious. And still, especially given this way it functions using byte pair encodings instead of actual words, the machine translation model is able to cope with some deviations from standard language. And so we get suggestions in Romanian, din ce în ce mai curios, or mai curios și mai curios, which are not very exciting. There are literal translations, but again, another key takeaway that you will see throughout the day will be that machine translation tends to produce literal translations. So do not expect it to perform the same changes and display the same creativity that a competent translator can, because we also have to admit that the world is very big and there are also quite a lot of amateur translators whose output quality is not that amazing. But before moving on, I also want to point out that even when some translations that we see online carry this label that they were reviewed by contributors, there's still mistakes in them. So it's not just that this option of translating is really boring, but it's also missing the Romanian diacritic for "în," which is a mistake. So this is also a call for all our Romanian speakers to really make the effort and use diacritics and correct texts without them. On the other hand, we also have examples where using machine translation as a back translation leads to improvements in the source text. And this is a little study that I didn't actually get around to writing up. But I started from picking up examples of Romanian either written in the press or from a conference on AI in 2020, and running such texts through Google Translate at that time, and then back into Romanian. So starting from the Romanian, which is not the best Romanian. It is very English influenced, although these were native speakers of Romanian, and also it's part of a presentation, by the way. And also it lacks diacritics. But if we run it through a machine translation model into English, because that's usually the combination that has the most resources, and then back into Romanian, we actually get a better source text. So, care este echilibrul bun dintre partea didactică și partea aplicată is a better way to formulate the same idea. Of course, we can still improve it, so it could be an echilibru ideal, but still, it's an improvement. However, another myth, so this is my opportunity to present key point number 3. Another myth regarding technology is that it continues to improve. So whatever was good remains good, and then we just add more examples of accuracy. Actually, the second screenshot was taken in 2021, I think, and I was just checking last night if things are the same. And actually, we've gone back. So more training data was added, more users validated data and options and suggestions, and still we're back to echilibrul între instead of dintre, and partea aplicativă instead of partea aplicată. So machine translation is not on a continuous increase of quality, let's say, in all cases. So before we start riots about how useful machine translation is, we really need to have this disclaimer, and everyone should, in their conversation, just take a little bit of time, take a deep breath, and acknowledge that really it depends. There are cases where it's really useful, and there are cases where it really misses the point. And as I said, it depends, it differs between language pairs, it also differs between domains within the same language pair, let alone across language pairs. So it really does depend. But that is not to say that we don't have already examples of raw machine translation being implemented at scale. And this is one of the examples from Airbnb, working with Translated in order to implement translated machine translation model, which is Model MT, into the Airbnb product descriptions and also the ratings. So by default, you get content into your preferred language, and that's machine translated, and it's a success story, and Airbnb hasn't looked back. Another example of a successful implementation is also the e-translation service offered by the European Commission that translates millions of pages every year and is embedded into a variety of websites, and it's also available to EU-based small and medium enterprises. So I'll leave the colleagues from the Commission and the Parliament to tell you more about this. But again, it's a genuine success story. On the other hand, to again lower the register a tiny bit, I'm sure we can all find the examples when machine translation really kind of misses the point. This is one example this is what your knee bandage contains, from German into English. A detonating pad. I really hope not. I quite like my knees. In fact, this would be something more along the lines of a pad to help your muscles de-stress or relax. So really not what you want. From such really terrible mistranslations to slightly, well, first an example of a terminology mismatch. Obiectivul 2 is translated into English as objective 2, which might be okay to some because, you know, it's a direct translation. So what's the problem? The problem is that this is a text about the UN goals, and they are goals, they're not objectives. So terminology must be kept. And again, a message to all students in the audience: really get used to reading style guides and being consistent in your use of terminology, and don't go along with suggestions because they kind of sound okay. So you really have to practice your subject matter expertise, domain knowledge, and technology can only help so far. Another example of a mistranslation, in Romanian, the text perhaps could be better formulated, but still it doesn't mean what the English translation, machine translation, says it does. So the 2030 agenda in the Romanian text doesn't aim to eradicate hunger as well as food security, but rather to eradicate hunger and ensure food security or support food security or whatever other alternative we might need. Fine. This is one of the main problems with neural machine translation, that the translation hypotheses, and they're all hypotheses, so please do not treat them as validated translations or think that there is some human intelligence behind them, because usually there's nothing. It's just the most statistically probable suggestion. That's what you get. That's the hypothesis. So these hypotheses are very fluent. For instance, in this case, we read that connected drive services are activated only 3 years after the first approval. So, you know, on the first glance, what's the problem? The problem is that actually these services are activated for only 3 years after the first approval. So it's completely different what the text, the source text says, and what the machine translation hypothesis says. And if we're not careful, if we don't catch this fine error, then there could be lawsuits, etc. Examples from the DGT team for how, when sometimes, not always, but sometimes when we ask machine translation models to translate long source sentences, and in this case, on the left-hand side, you only see part of the source sentence, with a lot of acronyms and a lot of names of institutions. Sometimes the model just cannot handle it, and you get a lot of made up information as well as repetitions. It's as if, you know, it's kind of telling you to leave it alone and give it a break. So this example is full of things to pick up as errors. And again, as a translator, you have to be very careful to make sure the acronyms are correct, that the proposed equivalent of an official name of an official body is actually the right one, especially when you work with neural machine translation, which is pretty much what everyone is working with right now. These kinds of hallucinations also appear, but they are very limited within texts. So for instance, in this example from English into German, the title is in English and the equivalent hypothesis starts in English, and we read enough to perhaps maybe trust the rest and not pay attention. But right before the end, we have this word that doesn't actually exist. So it's again a hallucinated word, which we might miss. Funnier hallucinations occur, for instance, liebe Kollegen and Kolleginnen. Even if you don't speak German, you can appreciate that this text doesn't say, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to begin by thanking the rapporteur for his excellent. So it's, again, based on training data, because everything is due to training data. And misaligned training data, we have instances where the output just makes things up. And I think the world is now used to AI making things up, especially in the last year or so. There have been a lot of studies as well as news reports about that. It still happens in the case of machine translation. However, again, it all depends. It's very curious indeed. However, in some cases, the additional information that you find in the translation, in the hypothesis of the machine translation model, is not necessarily wrong. So this is an example that actually I took a screenshot of following one of Sabina's workshops, which she kindly delivered for our students. And in here, the English says rule 138, but the Romanian custom of translating this in the parliament and probably in the commission as well is to actually give a bit more context and say articolul 138 din regulamentul de procedură, so from the procedural rule book. And that's technically a hallucination, so it could be evaluated as a addition of information that wasn't there, but in reality it's a helpful machine translation suggestion. So it's a useful hallucination. So not all hallucinations are as misleading as we might think. Other examples of things that are changed for unknown reasons, apart from the combination of byte pair encodings in the generation, in the decoding stage of the neural machine translation model, are things that are really difficult to spot if you are not very careful. So this is one example of names that were ever so slightly changed, or that were significantly changed and at the end ridiculously changed. And again, it's because the training data had a lot more Friedrich Schillers than Frederick Palms, and that's what the machine translation will then hand over to you. Another problem to look out for is that of distortions. And there is a really interesting study on English, French abstracts in the medical domain. And again, especially for the students in the audience, make sure that sometimes, I mean, quite often in medical text, especially in English ones, there are a lot of hedging devices. So these may, can, could, should. So these verbs are used often, but machine translation, again, due to training data, it tends to just kind of flatten them and remove this ambiguity. So in this particular study, these English hedging devices were actually converted into more affirmative statements or stronger forms of negation in French. So instead of may, it translated as a can, which is, or will, which is really not what you want. There are well-documented examples of neural machine translation reinforcing stereotypes, and this is just one where gender is a problem. And also there are examples of gender-neutral language. So in this case, it's a new spelling in German that is an inclusive one that's actually just rendered instead of dear colleagues, is just rendered as ladies, which is perhaps better than saying men, but still it's a mistake. And finally, I think another example of problems with neuro-machine translation output that actually pass the revision stage as well. So this was a revised text, and the numbers are different. And again, revisers skipped over it, which is a problem. This is an even bigger problem on an official document. The date is just replaced with something very random. I am looking at the time, and I'm wondering, do I have 15 more minutes, 10 more minutes?
You have 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Super. Thank you so much. So a few more examples, again, to illustrate the sometimes really curious, to quote Alice, but genuinely unexplainable to my translator's mind, impact of punctuation. So a simple dash converted to a semicolon actually led to the information that I really wanted to include in the source being also included in the machine translation hypothesis, because otherwise it was omitted. So really very bizarre behaviors sometimes from machine translation models. So we talk about post-editing a lot. What are some assumptions and some corrections of definitions that we need to be aware of? First of all, the ISO standard, because there is an ISO standard for machine translation, states that post-editing is the act of editing and correcting machine translation output. But that's a problem because usually editing is monolingual. And so this gives the impression that, oh, just working with machine translation output is very simple. You just read it and maybe make one or two changes and done. Whereas it's an act of revision. You still have to look at the source in order to make sure that the target is not just fluent, but accurate, because we've seen a whole bunch of accuracy problems so far. Also, post-editing sometimes is presenting as, no big deal, just another way of revising. But actually, this assumes that the machine translation system completes a full translation, which isn't the case. It's just giving us what's statistically most likely given the training data, but nothing more. And there's also an assumption that post-editing requires less effort than translation from scratch, which, again, some studies show that technical effort, so typing, is reduced when we post-edit. Also, sometimes temporal effort, so the time we spend on the segment is also reduced. And to be honest, that's the main reason post-editing is so embedded in the work of international organizations, but also other institutions, simply because translators cannot cope with a huge volume of texts coming their way. And sometimes the quality doesn't have to be super amazing. And so post-editing might do the job. But there are differences actually between revision and post-editing. So make sure that when you think about it or you discuss it with your employers or your clients, you make them aware that machine translation isn't the same as a translation done by a competent translator. So it's also post-editing aims to preserve as much of the output as possible, which again makes the whole process a bit more clumsy than perhaps it could be. So there is a genuine problem in the industry that post-editing is seen as a revision task to reduce turnaround times and lower costs, for sure. And also it doesn't help that we have results and reports such as this one from Intento from 2022, which tell us that 97% of the machine translation output that they run through their machine translation hub required no human review. And this gets people really excited. And it's actually, when you start reading the report, you see that only a few very limited number of domains were of acceptable quality, and also a very limited number of target languages were of an acceptable quality. So there are lots and lots of disclaimers. A quick example, because we spoke about large language models and artificial intelligence, and as we heard, they are increasingly asked to perform machine translation tasks. So if we ask ChatGPT to translate from English into Romanian, we're going to the conference on machine translation technology tomorrow. The first result is a very literal phrase for phrase translation. But interestingly, if you start giving examples, so fuzzy matches, they're called for translation memory users. So alternatives or preferred translations from similar segments or of similar segments, we see that we get a different output, one which is more to our preference. So here, after one example where the adverb is moved from the end to the beginning, even though it's not the same sentence, we just, based on one example, we get a suggestion which starts with the adverb and also has a different preposition, one which is more appropriate. Instead of de, we have despre. So there are quite interesting examples of how the large language model adapts its output based on examples. Here there are a few examples of how we can also influence the terminology by giving examples of our preferred. So instead of machine translation, we want autotraducere. Sorry, there was someone? No, maybe it was just me. And that's reflected in the output as well. And if we want to change the verb from mă voi duce to I will participate, so from go to participate, again, just with a few examples, this can be easily done. But generally, I think one of the key things to bear in mind is that just like this really interesting cartoon from Wolfgang Amner, which I saw about 10 days ago, suggests we really need to exercise our brains and to make sure that we don't use artificial intelligence and machine translation to just sort of iron everything out and just make one continuous thing. Given that so don't worry, I've just stopped the slideshow for a second because I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we don't have too much time left. And I would like to show you some of the work that we do in our center before we have to say goodbye. So the question when using this all this technology always comes back to, but what do we do with it? Are we good at handling it? Are professional translators good at post-editing? And it really depends. The answer depends depending on who you are looking into. So, you know, it will be a different answer in the institutions as opposed to some professional world business. But what is really important, and again, to the students out there, what's really important is to make sure that you develop your attention to detail, because professional translators aren't very good at post-editing, according to some studies, but they're also not very good at translating, according to some studies, and revising. So you really need to up your game. And I want to put on your radars this really interesting study about revision, which will talk about a new way of revising in person. So what can we do to help translators? Let's look towards solutions. One option would be to build more interactive environments, more like the DeepL option, which allows translators to click on individual suggestions and then see whether there are any alternatives that they might prefer better. This is one interesting way. Another interesting way would be to build more multimedia environments for post-editing, because the technology has progressed. We have large language models now, a lot of hype around them. Machine translation is neural, no longer rule-based, but we still work in the same CAT tools, and they offer the same functionalities and not much in terms of multimedia. So again, to put it on your radar, the work of Jean-François Alain, super interesting and super relevant about working together and collaborating in a European institution. But what essentially we are looking for is to have more examples like this. So a CAT tool, which has an option for translators to dictate, as well as an option for translators or post-editors to listen to the text as well. Because in our work, we're finding that having this option just activates different areas of the brain, and it really can be very helpful in spotting errors and also producing more accurate and even more fluent with the right register translations. Those of you who don't have access to MateCat, and the option with the speech synthesis actually was done for us for one of our projects, so that's not officially out yet. Still, you can use a plugin for Trados, which is called text-to-speech, which allows you to play and listen to the target or the source segment as you work. If you don't have Trados, you can still benefit from listening to the target when you use Word, because also Word has this option to read aloud the text for you. So let's make the most of the tools that we have. And why are we working on this new way of post-editing or revising? It's really not that new. It's just trying to use an artificial voice to simulate a scenario where the translators actually don't have a partner who can read their translation to them and then discuss and improve it. It's based on work we started at the University of Leeds regarding the revision process, and which indicated that in terms of cognitive effort, which we measured with an eye tracker, which gives you these lovely images, there was no additional cognitive effort when translators could also listen to the segments. But in terms of the output quality, the revised translations were much more accurate when the translator was listening as well, not just correcting in silence. So then we, as I mentioned, we got funding from Imminent, which is the research arm of Translated, which maintain MateCat. And again, with eye trackers in our labs, we I tracked 21 translators who were post-editing but with
COVID-19
sound.
stigma and discrimination. Should we be scared of people who have had COVID-19?
I hope this is coming through.
Covid-19 Stigma und Diskriminierung. Sollten wir Angst vor Menschen haben, die Covid-19 hatten? Stigmatisation et discrimination liées à la Covid-19. Devrions-nous avoir peur des personnes qui ont eu la Covid-19?
Estigma y discriminación por COVID-19. ¿Deberíamos tener miedo de las personas que han tenido COVID-19?
Stigmatizarea și discriminarea în contextul COVID-19 ar trebui să ne fie frică de persoanele care au avut COVID-19.
So I'm hoping that came through. And this new way of working, now let's jump to the conclusions, was, well, first some findings and then the conclusions. This new way of working, we found, still didn't mean that post editors do not have to consult external resources. I think that's also important to mention. Translation, translators depend on external resources, also post editors. So let's not imagine post editing is this very fast, simple activity for which you need no additional support. We found that our participants mostly preferred having the option to listen to the source and target segments. We also found that the quality improved a little bit, although the effect was not substantial, when the sound was available. Also, you can read this as at least it didn't get worse. But the improvement was actually more noticeable when the post editors went over 1,000 words an hour, which increasingly they are asked to do because the volume of work is so large. When there was sound, also they were tempted, or they just didn't type as much. So they just made more of the changes that actually needed to be made rather than make preferential changes, and that's always good. But initially, at least in our experiment, the productivity slightly decreased. It was their first time in these environments, so there might be also another factor. But we didn't see the productivity increases that we saw in other studies. So we still need more research in there. We saw that they were less focused on the target text because they could also hear it, and it helped them produce a more fluent translation that way. And also we saw that the work patterns changed for some participants. So for instance, some post editors have this habit of doing the post editing once and then going back over the text and then going a third time over the text. Whereas when they were working with sound, because they could always listen to their changes, they felt more confident to just post edit once the whole text and then also go just one more time to check and then finish the task. And what was really interesting, and that's it's a warning sign. It's a key message, but also a warning sign. Sometimes having post-editing experience doesn't necessarily lead to actually producing better translations. So we need to really look more into our data there, but it seems that there might be a level of maybe fatigue, maybe we don't know what to call it yet. Maybe people just getting used to the machine translation output and getting used to some of its errors and just giving up on correcting them anymore. So that's a big problem, of course, for some texts. So conclusions, with apologies for talking so long. Machine translation is increasingly embedded in pretty much all the environments we have. So we really need to manage expectations of managers on one hand and clients, and also be proactive and find better ways to handle it. And this idea of proactivity was very present at a JAMCAT conference last week, where the international organizations heard about success stories where translators drove the implementation of technology instead of having that imposed on them. There is potential of using speech technologies for translation, revision, and PEMT, and we really need to look at that, especially as more and more machine translation is rolled out. But, and again, big message to the students in the audience, we need to really work on our translation, our language, our drafting, our writing, our subject matter expertise skills as well. They remain essential. But not only that, we ran 2 workshops yesterday and the day before, again with UN and EU organizations and some universities. And one of the big messages was the importance of being able to collaborate, to adapt, to remain curious, to manage processes, to communicate well. So all these soft skills that are crucial nowadays for hiring. And I'm sure the colleagues who are giving the workshops will reinforce these ideas. Final point. Look out also for the impact of neuro-machine translation as well as large language models on the language ecosystem as well as a whole, and also the content dissemination. And why am I saying that? Because if you're looking at what kind of information you get when you ask ChatGPT for whatever, the same thing in several languages, you will find that actually in the languages, well, for instance, in Romanian, French, and English, you will find that the text in French and English is a machine translation of the English text. So we, or the general public, has this impression that ChatGPT knows their language and it gives them personalized results because it speaks their own language. But actually what it does is just disseminating the English information, because English was the biggest proportion of the training data in the output, in the training data. So it's disseminating all that information into other languages. So yes, let's make sure our brains remain nice and fluffy instead of turn to spaghetti. I really apologize for going over time. I hope you'll forgive me. And I thank you, and I hope it was interesting.